Well, hello everyone. This is Mary Nunley coming at you live with our show today. Of course, I've got my co-host,
Amadeus Dudley.
and today we are delighted to have as our special guest, Steve Kidd. And I met Steve, I guess it's been a couple months now, at a 3-day conference, and we just kind of hit it off talking about gamification and online course creation. And Steve comes with a really unique perspective because he helps people bring their ideas to life in the form of a book. And so I'm going to start off by letting Steve just introduce himself and tell you a little bit better what he does, since I've completely butchered it. And then I've got some questions that Amadeus and I are going to ask, and we're just going to have this fun interview. So, Steve, take it away.
Hi, my name is Steve Kidd. I am a third generation minister, an international best-selling author of multiple books. I help people write, publish, and market their books to bestseller. What I really love helping people do is find their clarity in their voice, in their writing, in what they do. Clarity is powerful. And it's in that we discover that the things that seemed the most impossible often are the things that really are the best in our life. That's where the real opportunities lie. In fact, often I tease that what you'll find is that it's not a cloud with a silver lining. It's actually silver with cotton candy included.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And you just like speak to me because you're always using food analogies, whether it's cotton candy or pizza or something like that. And one of the things that Stephen Amadeus and I have been working on is a course for prospective authors. And I'm not going to give away a lot about that. But the thing that I really liked about Steve is he's open to trying some new things, including gamifying his course, but also gamifying his Facebook group. So before we get into the nitty gritty of book writing, why don't you just share a little bit about why and how you decided to make your Facebook group more engaging, more interactive, and to help your tribe have more fun?
Well, we all struggle with people consistently interacting with our group. Either A, they're constantly spamming it with stuff that has nothing to do with the group. None of us have ever had that happen. Um, or, you post something really impactful and it's just crickets. And then you're like, oh, what happened, right? And so I was looking for a way to really get people engaged. And ultimately, let's face it, all of us are selfish. We want to know what's in it for us. And when we're asking somebody to comment, to share, to whatever, if we can give them, what did you call it the other day? A virtual Kit Kat bar.
Yes.
Then there's something in it for them. If only we can now teleport real Kit Kat bars, we will be just totally gamified.
I would like it. And I'm sure that there is a way. We just haven't quite gotten there yet. But I love your sense of adventure. I love your willingness to try things. And I'm going to kind of toss the interview question into Amadeus's court, first of all. And he's giving me this look like you didn't tell me I was going to do this. But when we first met you, one of the things that we had talked about with you was the idea of us writing a book as well. And Amadeus asked this question, the one about why would we want to write a book?
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. And I did ask that, which was going back exactly to what you said of, as much as you said things, how this helped me. And I wanted to know, like, what possible benefits do we as a company that, helps people get their courses online, develop LMS, host on LMSs and gamify their courses. How does a book help us? And I guess that can probably apply to anyone in other fields of how does getting a book out there help them?
Yeah. And ultimately, it's fair to let people know I'm a marketing company with a strong publishing division rather than a publishing company which probably doesn't know anything about marketing. Most of them, their idea of marketing is if you build it, they will come, which never happens. Didn't even really happen in that movie, but that's a whole nother story. But it's really about the credentials that you have. So in the late 70s, early 80s, if you really wanted to be taken seriously as an expert, you would have wanted to have had your PhD, to be Dr. So-and-so.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were Dr. So-and-so, you knew your stuff. Now, nobody ever asked. I mean, think about this one today, and then next time you go to the doctor, you'll be thinking this in your head. Did your doctor graduate first in his class from Harvard Medical School? Or did your doctor graduate last in his class from, Jimmy's local university, right? Both of them are now doctors. They both have credentials on the wall, but, it makes a difference.
Mhm.
Being a best-selling author is literally the number one influencer credential, even more so than being a medical doctor. And it gives you the credibility. So from a marketing standpoint, whenever I'm marketing anything, a person, a course they have, whatever, the very first thing I want to do is have it be based off of a bestseller. So I'll give you a perfect example. I know you guys like movies. Over 50% of all movies that get made are based off of best-selling books. And over 80% of all movies that win the Academy Award are based off of bestsellers. That gives you an idea of just how powerful bestseller is when you're talking about marketing anything you're going to do in the world.
Wow, that is powerful. So when you talk about bestseller, are we talking about, bestseller in my neighborhood, bestseller on Amazon, bestseller on the New York Times list? All of those have different levels of credibility. Does it matter, like, based on who your audience is, or is there like one that's like the gold standard? Like, you'd mentioned the number one in your class from Harvard Medical School versus, last in your class from Joey's local medical gravedigger school. Is there a credential that means more, or a bestseller that means more? Or is it just important to have that credibility?
So we will give the New York Times credit for a very good marketing ploy they've done to make us all think of New York Times bestseller list when we think of bestsellers. Really, the one that I only spend my time with, and the one that we focus on, is Amazon's bestseller list. Amazon's bestseller list is the only one that I know of that is based purely off of statistics. So there's an algorithm that is the primary piece of it is if your book was number 2 and another book was number 3, that means that literally your book sold more copies than the book at number 3 during a specific time period. Now, granted, because they're automated and computerized, they can update more frequently than what the New York Times can. But New York Times gets a list. They actually get it from the Nielsen company who does, TV ratings. But then they very highly editorialize it. There was a couple of years ago, a young lady that was number 1 New York Times bestseller, and they actually took the award away from her because they found out that she sold it more of grassroots campaigns. New York Times bestseller list really just means that you inked a big deal with Walmart or another big box retailer. It doesn't necessarily mean anybody ever bought any of the copies of your book. And so we want to focus on A, what can we predict if we're going to guarantee you're going to be a bestseller, but also B, what's really real. And that is really, I don't know whether if you did a Google search, whether it would say it's the gold standard, like if you did a Google search for what's the best college in the world, But as far as really meaning something, that is really the gold standard from what it means to be a best-selling author.
Wow. Okay. And I didn't
Didn't know
realize
that.
that is fascinating. So now that you've convinced the audience that they should become a best-selling author, you've got this idea in your head. Okay, great. I want to write a book. What do I do next?
So don't write.
Okay.
That's the easy
Wow.
answer. Success leaves clues is a phrase we've all heard before. We're all familiar with Sir Richard Branson from, the different Virgin companies, Virgin Mobile, Virgin Airlines, all of that. He writes all of his books via interview. The book, The Four Agreements, was written that way. There's many other, books that you probably have read that were written via interview. Now, there's a difference between being written via interview and being written by a ghostwriter. A ghostwriter does use an interview process, but then they take the notes from your conversation and they make a book. What we want to really do is take your words, your voice, your style. The closer we can get a book to being, to having a person say, I felt like you were talking just directly to me, Mary. You know, that is really the big win when it comes to what people really want to read, is a book that makes them feel part of you. And so, yeah, using interview, that's the number one piece of it. Secondarily, really, and just as important, is who really owns your book. And now this is a sly one that the publishing industry is really, really good at. I got to give them kudos for it, because they will even ink contracts for you or with you that say you own 100% of the rights of your book. And on paper, you do. Here's the bottom line. Because, keeping in mind, before COVID, Amazon was selling about 80% of all books being sold. Now it's basically 100%, but ultimately Amazon has an agreement, a contractual agreement with a person who they identify via an email address, a unique email address. And so that person's email address agreed to all of their terms of service and is liable for, if they break any of those terms of service, that could cost them their whole account. So of course, obviously if you have hundreds of them on your account, you're going to be even more careful with it. But the bottom line is that it's their bank account, their email address that Amazon has that relationship with. And so really, as far as Amazon's concerned, you don't own your book. Your name can be the author of record on it. Honestly, that's just a form field. You could put your name as Joe Smith on your book. People do pen names all the time.
Mhm.
And Amazon doesn't check to see, is this really who you are? They will check if you, put out a book with the title and the same author's name that already exists. Like if you were to put out a book called Lord of the Rings and my name is J.R.R. Tolkien, they would probably question whether you have the rights to publish that book, right?
Okay.
So ultimately that's how they determine who owns the book and who they're paying. And that's who they have the relationship with. And most people find that they don't actually own their book.
Oh, wow.
Wow. That's
So-
crazy.
If I were to write a book, just to make sure I understand this, if I were to write a book and I use the email address ugg@yahoo.com
Mhm.
and got into an agreement with Amazon to publish my book, ugg@yahoo.com owns the rights to it?
Well, whoever owns ugg@yahoo.com. I mean, we could go deep because we're all tech geeks, so we can go geek a little bit here for a while. I would always recommend to a person that you should own your domain name and that your primary email address that you're going to do important things on is under that. Or at the very least, if you're using, say, a Gmail account, which most all of us do, that Gmail account is, there's a contact email that you have that's assigned to that and a phone number. And you want that email to be your domain name and that phone number to be your phone number. So then, yeah, it'd be cool to look and see. I doubt you could get ugg at yahoo.com these days. But yeah, if you had the contractual relationship with Yahoo as them seeing you as being ugg at yahoo.com, then you would be the owner of the book.
Oh, wow. The more you know.
Well, that's
Yeah.
definitely something I don't think I've ever considered in my life about needing to worry about.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
Well, and most people don't. Most people, they end up finding out that, HarperCollins, whatever other book publisher, they actually own their content. And then what ends up happening is you create a course because, that's what we're doing.
Mhm.
And they give you a cease and desist order because you're using their content. That's why Terry Brooks, I love Terry. I'm sure you're
Yeah.
familiar with
Oh, yes.
all of Terry's stuff. That's why, in spite of how wildly popular Terry is, other than one not so great TV series that came out a couple of years ago, they've never made a movie or a TV series out of Terry's stuff because the publisher is the one who has the right to do it. Terry would love to see his stuff on the big screen. All of us would love to see it, but we don't get a vote. It's the publisher who has to get what they want in order for it to happen.
Well, yeah, and I've seen something similar with Neil Gaiman where they're, because of some of his comics, and he's like, I would love to do a COVID version. But I got to get permission from the publisher, which is kind of strange because if you wrote it, you basically, yeah. And again, I have worked with some companies helping with textbooks. So I understand that if I'm a ghost writer on a textbook, it's whoever the primary author was, and I was contracted to just do a specific job, write these chapters, write these questions, which is very different than if it was my own book. Which leads me to my next question. It's not quite as geeky for the folks that are just like, oh gosh, okay, you guys are going down this nerd rabbit hole as they often do. You mentioned that the best way to write a book is not to write a book, but to be interviewed. And you talked a little bit about the interview versus the ghostwriter. So if I wanted to go down this interview path to write a book, can you tell us just a little bit in the audience, like what that process would look like? Would it just be like, Amadeus and I have a conversation and we record it and send it to you? Or what's that? How does that work?
Well, you could most definitely do that. That's kind of the low hanging fruit of it. I do have a Write Your Bestseller in 1 hour workshop that we've done for years that can walk you through that and help you create the whole framework for your book. And then you could go from there. I always say, I don't know why God chooses to give us the giftings that he does, but helping you really form your book is definitely mine. And I do really enjoy it. The whole concept of getting you talking, asking you questions. I have a formula in the back of my head that I'm doing, but really I just want to have a conversation with you to get you talking. And then we take it from there and shape it. After that, we're going to do a content edit and say, hey, you were telling us this great story about Aunt Jan, and then you never told us what happened to Aunt Jan, and now I got to know what happened, those kind of things. So, that comes after, it's recorded and transcribed. But yeah, it's just a matter of really having a conversation. But then, of course, obviously having somebody that knows how to lead that conversation makes it so much more powerful.
Right. Well, I was gonna say, because if Amadeus and I had the conversation, we would be all over the place because it's like, oh, this is, and I see that with, when we work with course creators too. It's like, oh, this would be great. Oh, okay, let's put it on the table versus working with somebody that kind of, like you said, had the flow in the back of your head and sort of knows how to guide the conversation so that the book does make sense. I mean, there may still be some sidebars. So let's say that somebody wanted to get started and use this process, and they decided after watching this interview, it's like, yes, I want to work with Steve. Take us through that whole process from start to finish. Like, how do they find you? How long does it take to write the book in this style, assuming that they have their thoughts somewhat coherent? What is it? And I don't want you to give away all of your secrets, but just sort of like, what could somebody expect? So it's like, okay, great. I want to have a bestseller and I want to have it by January the 1st. And it's, November 25th. Amadeus is laughing hysterically, but, there are people that are just like, yeah, I need it, 4 weeks. It's like, no, there's no way you're going to have a course in 4 weeks, but here's what we can give you. So you've got that person who wants that best-selling book, let's say 6 weeks.
Be generous.
How do they get a hold of you? And then, take them through that process, like a realistic process.
So they can, of course, find my Facebook page, Thriving Bestsellers, on Facebook. We'll take you to the page. Or just even easier, go to askstevekidd.com. That is 2 Ds. And that'll take you straight to my schedule. You can hop on and get a 15-minute call for me, and we can talk about where you are and what's next on that. As far as the process from there, actually, the system is built to take you from that interview. So we do the strategy session before that, but then from that interview to your ebook launch date, we do the print book a couple of days later because we want every book in print to have a seal on it that says it's a bestseller, as opposed to having some floating out there that don't. So there you go. You got behind the curtain. But literally from interview to that bestseller launch in as little as 30 days.
Wow. And so how long is a typical interview then? And again, I don't want to give away any trade secrets. So if you're like, no, Mary, this is like, secret stuff for my clients, just feel free to say that. What's a good length for a book, page wise? And how long does that interview process take to get that many pages of content?
So the interview typically is about an hour to an hour and a half.
That's it? Wow.
Yeah.
I was expecting something longer, honestly.
Yeah.
I was
So
thinking
Amazon.
5 hours.
Yeah. So, and sometimes we have to do a second one, but that's what it's intended to do. Amazon's done a lot of research, because they sell books, right? And they have found that if your book is 100 pages or less, that 60% or more of the people that get it will finish the book.
Wow.
If your book is 101 to 200 pages, that drops down to 20%.
Wow.
And if the book goes over 200 pages, it's actually less than 3% of people that ever actually finish that book. And if you think about all the books you have on your shelf, that you
Right.
never finished, I mean, and I'm even thinking of fiction books that are sitting on my shelf that, I was reading it, and then, Life, and then it's a great book. I just never finished it. Right. And
Right. Or it was appropriate at that time in your life. Like, I've
yeah,
got some books of like, oh, I was, staying with a sick friend or something. So I picked up a book to read. They got
yeah.
better. The book went away and I never finished
Mhm.
it. Well, and again, I guess on that same note, nonfiction, fiction, graphic novels, is there a better kind of book to go for a bestseller?
Well, I've done all of them. Obviously, from a marketing standpoint, typically a person is looking at a nonfiction book because they're wanting to lead to speaking or a course or those kind of things. So, a fantasy world that you created isn't necessarily. But the flip side to it is how much would you pay for we won't even go one-on-one session with Neil Gaiman. I mean, just even a group, where it was a small group of like 10 people and you could ask him anything you wanted to, what would that cost? What would you be willing to pay for one of those?
Right.
So it definitely works for fiction. And then of course, children's books and graphic novels, they're a little different creature because then essentially you're really looking at a series of pictures is, really what that ends up being as far as the book is concerned. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, we've done all of them.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking like even some of the folks that we work with, they serve vast array of clientele. So for some folks, a fiction or a young adult or child's book might make more sense than a nonfiction kind of like business related book or psychology book. So I want to make sure that folks as they're listening to this, whether it's on our channel or YouTube or whatever, are realizing like, hey, this book writing applies to a vast array of topics. It's not like, oh yeah, I have to be a best-selling author with a boring computer science book. It can really be whatever you want. Is that
Well, so let's go back to the example I was giving earlier about medical doctors.
Mhm.
Or just the doctor title in general. So, Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil, a lot of Dr. So-and-sos that are now, their full-time job is they're a talk show host, really. I mean, hopefully if you like them, you like the content, but ultimately they're a talk show host. They're in a time slot that's where Geraldo Rivera used to be, and Dr. Phil and Phil Donahue and all of them. I mean, it's that same thing. But the doctor in how they're addressed, like Dr. Phil's a perfect example. I don't honestly know anybody that's actually been to him for therapy, as far as like, oh yeah, way before Dr. Phil was, I went to him for, kind of thing.
right?
But we immediately assign authority to him as the therapist that his show is based on. Same thing's true with Dr. Oz. I mean, I've read articles about people that he's been a medical doctor too, but when we take advice from him, we don't actually go to his office and have him run tests and all kinds of stuff on us. We just immediately take his credibility. The same thing's true when it comes to you being a best-selling author. So if your book is total flight of fantasy, just absolutely your imagination ran wild, and you become a best-selling author, well, guess what? Every time you're introduced, my good friend Carl Michelle, his book came out. It's called 365 Hip Hop great book. We could talk more about that if you want to. But he said to me after I saw, the next time I saw him, he's like, no, from now on, you can't just introduce me as Carl Michel. I'm international best-selling author Carl Michel. It makes a huge amount of difference.
That is big. So it's like, I speak for different groups and things. And so being able to say best-selling author just adds that little bit of extra credibility, which is cool. And yes, we'll wrap up talking about hip hop, but I have one last question. Everything goes in cycles. So like you were saying, in the 70s and 80s, it was having your PhD. Now it's having that best-selling author. How much longer do you think that best-selling author credential is going to have that same cachet? And what do you think might be the next thing around the corner?
Well, so it's never going to go away.
Okay.
Best-selling author is one of those, and I suppose you could put doctor, especially medical doctor, in that same kind of field. It's one of those that's going to always be instant credibility. Authors of books from the 1700s or 1800s, that are, mind-blowing as far as the numbers they've sold now, we still apply credibility to Think and Grow Rich, for example, from 1918,
Right.
And so
from Machiavelli.
Right. So that's not going to go away ever.
His eyes lit up just like mine. That's one of our favorite authors.
As far as for what's coming next, eventually it will be something that is another version of truly influencing people. Because really, ultimately, all of those we're talking about, influencer credentials, we probably, by the time it comes around, we probably won't be calling it influencers. Just kind of like, I remember a day when we didn't used to call coaches, they were mentors or advisors or things like that.
Right.
But yeah, it's going to be something in that it's about having an influence that makes a difference in somebody else's life that will always be the thing. Whether the internet even went away. I mean, I can't ever imagine it not, but if we had an EMP event and there was no electricity on the whole of the planet, there would still be people of influence, and, then we might go back to phrases like chieftain or something like that. So
good point. So follow up to the follow-up about, best-selling author and stuff. There are studies that I've read that are saying people are reading less and less. And so why would I want to be a best-selling author? People have attention spans of a gnat. It has to be instantly consumed. Nobody's going to sit around and read a book. Do you find that is only applying to a certain subset of the population? Or do you think that there's something to be said for people just don't read anymore?
So without knowing it, there's actually 3 answers to your question.
Okay.
So number one, going back to Amazon's statistic about 100-page or less book, that is one of the major drivers to that. We live in a 140-character Twitter world, but we also live in a very search engine optimized kind of a world. And that allows us to write a book that takes a point, makes it really clear, and then lets us make a clear action from that one point. That would make it then highly searchable versus, Google can't say, hey, chapter 25 in this book has exactly the answer you're looking for. But Amazon spends billions with Google in advertising. So if the book is specific, they can bring up your specific answer. In addition to that, it really has to do with, I don't know that reading has really gone away, because if anything, we do it in smaller bites, but we actually probably read more now than we ever did before.
Okay.
Because we consume our content on screens. Now, granted, some of the things we're reading would not be okay with English lit professors, and we've turned LOL into a spoken word and things like that, But yeah, I mean, if you didn't know, imagine for a second not knowing how to read at all and living in the current world.
Be
I think-
atrocious.
Right? I mean, something as simple as here's the link to join me in Zoom. I mean, you could probably eventually learn the skill that when I see a link, I click on it.
Yeah.
But, if you don't know how to read the words, you're going to eventually click on the link that gives somebody your bank account information.
Right.
Right. No,
you
I think that's a very valid point. So maybe the gloom and doom, the naysayers are saying people don't read. What they're really saying is people aren't taking the time to read long form books like we used to. Like you said, the 500-page novel that people would curl up with because they had nothing else to do. And I, even for myself, find I don't read quite as many 500-page books as I used to.
Well, and I'll move to the wrap-up question here in just a moment, but this is just, I know on an international scale in like China and Japan, it's very popular to write your novels as entirely a chapter a day web content. Like it's not even a full published book. It's just every day you write us a chapter, then your reader's going to read that one chapter and they come back tomorrow. Instead of you need to, write this book out, they're writing 2,000-3,000 chapters for these books that are just going on for ages. And that's how, a lot of that popularity is there instead of the print media.
Well, think about how powerful that could be. Whether you're a fiction author and you're doing it like that, or you're a nonfiction, if every week, every month, however quickly you can or want to do that, there was a next book, there was a next thing and a next thing, and you were really deeply engaged with those people. I mean, even for example, John Maxwell, who has hundreds of books he's written, his last series he did as 100+ page books. There were 5 of them rather than writing a 400-page book like you would have written before.
Yeah, because even one of the things I've seen with a lot of the very popular, very productive fiction writers are these, like, I don't know, who is it? One of them was like Hot Shots or something like that. And it's mini books, but it takes those same characters that you've grown to like, respect, trust, fictional characters, and now puts them in these short stories. Even Jim Butcher did that with Dresden. There was, the series of short story Dresden's ones, and then the long ones, and then he made us wait for like 7 years before the next 2 books came out. It was
still, he's still not G.R.R. Martin.
Well, that's true.
On that note, we are getting pretty close to time. So we'll ask you about that hip hop, and we'll wrap up with that.
365 Hip Hop, Carl Michel, Michel, an amazing book. So anybody that's ever listened to any hip hop, some of it's lyrically not, we'll just use challenging. We'll just stay there, right? It's not necessarily something you would find to be motivational. Well, Carl has found a way, and I bet you could give him the most raunchy song that you've ever heard in your whole life, and he does find a positive motivational quote, and he uses it to reach teens with music that they're used to and helps them see a powerful message buried inside of, something that they didn't even know was there. And it's such an amazing way for a person to use what they love and make an impact in the world.
Yeah, and I think that's really more so than, to me anyway, more so than even having that bestseller credential, which would be really nice to have. It's that epic meaning and calling, which, we've talked about in some of our sessions, working on gamification and courses and stuff. It's like making that impact. That's that epic meaning and calling. I want to change a young person's life and speak in a language that they can relate to. And that's so powerful. So I appreciate you sharing that story. We are just about out of time. So this is your last chance to promote yourself. We've already learned how we can reach you. Ask Steve Kidd with d.com to set up a 15-minute discovery call. You can find him on Facebook, but is there anything else that you've got in the works that you want to tell people about, or, something coming up that it's like, oh yeah, I just need to share this, or can they join your Facebook group even if they're not one of your authors?
Absolutely. They can join the Facebook group. They're welcome to come over, Thriving Bestsellers, and join that. Friend me on Facebook, any of those kind of things. They can listen to my podcast, Thriving Entrepreneur, They're all 6 years of it are at wehelpyouthrive.com.
Okay.
And ultimately, really, it boils down to you are uniquely brilliant. You are created for a purpose, and the world does need you. There's nobody else that ever existed that is exactly like you, and no one else that ever will be exactly like you. And if you don't maximize who you are today, you'll be different tomorrow, but who you are today, nobody else can. Nobody can fill the space that is you.
Wow. Powerful words to end on. Thank you so much. So, signing off for today's episode, this is Mary and
Amadeus.
we will see you again next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.